Some people think folk tales are only for children, but that is not so. This story is for adults. And from its humble beginning in France, it has spread around the world and has been translated into many languages. So listen up now to the folk tale of the man who planted trees. Ruth.
Thank you, George. Not quite 100 years ago, a young man named Jean decided to travel through a part of his country that he'd never visited before. And so he set out on his journey, and after a couple of days he realised that the landscape around him had changed quite considerably, and he found himself in an area that was barren and dry. The only thing that seemed to grow was the wild lavender. He passed through villages where things looked a bit ramshackle, and the people there were charcoal burners. They had a hard life, and they were hard people. They seemed to struggle with everything in life. Every misunderstanding and disagreement became magnified because they were cut off from everything around them. And the wind would blow across the barren moors and fray their nerves, and they would often talk of wanting to leave, and yet they never did. And as the young man continued on his journey, at one point he found himself running out of water. His container was getting low, and so he was eagerly expecting a village to come up along the road where he could replenish his supply. But unfortunately, the next village that he came to was run down even more, and it was completely abandoned and desolate. And he searched in vain but couldn't find any water supply at all. The river had run dry and the well was empty. And so he walked through the village hoping to find something later on down the road. And soon in the distance he saw something on the horizon, and he thought it was a tree stump. But as he got closer, he realised it was a figure. And eventually he came upon a shepherd who was looking after his sheep. The shepherd was very quiet and reserved, but also very hospitable, and invited Jean to come to his house and to share his water, which he had from a very deep natural well. And then he extended hospitality even more to Jean and asked him if he would mind having his evening meal with him, and then he could also stay the night and be refreshed for the next day and the next part of his journey. And so Jean willingly agreed and accepted this hospitality. But after the evening meal, the shepherd went to the corner of his room and picked up a large sack and brought it to the table. And he spilled some of the contents out onto the table, and there in front of them was a large pile of acorns. And the shepherd sat down and began to sort through the acorns. He picked up one and looked at it. If it was clean and healthy and whole, he would put it to one side. If it was bruised and diseased or cracked, he would discard it. And eventually he ended up with a pile of good, whole acorns. Then he began to put the acorns into piles of 10. And once he had 10 piles of 10, he had his 100 acorns. He gathered those together, put them in a bag, and set them by the door. Then he retired for the evening. Well, the next morning, Jean woke up refreshed and ready for a new day. But he found the place to be so peaceful that he decided he would stay for the day. And so he asked the shepherd if he could travel with him, go with him as he looked after his sheep, and see what he got up to during the day. And the shepherd willingly agreed. And so they began to prepare for their day out in the fields with the sheep. The shepherd picked up his staff, which Jean noticed was steel rather than wood. And then, just before they left, he went and picked up the little bag of acorns that he had prepared the night before, dipped them into a bucket of water, and off they set on their way. So they reached the place where the pasture was, and the shepherd made sure the sheep were settled and comfortable. And then, instead of resting himself, he travelled on just a little bit down the path, and he started to do something which Jean thought was quite strange. He took his steel rod and he dug it into the ground and made a little hole, took an acorn, popped it in, and covered it over with his foot. He took a few more steps, put in the rod, dropped in the acorn, covered it over with his foot, and he continued like that for the rest of the morning. And eventually he had planted his 100 acorns. And Jean was absolutely astounded at this. And he tried to find out a little bit more information about what this man was doing and why. And so he discovered that this man had been planting acorns for 3 years. And he figured that he had planted about 100,000 of them. He figured that maybe he had 20,000 that had come up as shoots. But he might lose about 10,000 or so because of disease or animals eating them. But eventually he would have 10,000 oak trees. And Jean was amazed. And so then he decided to find out a little bit more about this shepherd himself. Who was he? Well, his name was Elzéard Bouffier. He was 55 years old, and he had previously been a farmer, looking after the land with his cattle and his sheep and his grain and his corn. But unfortunately, disaster had come to his farm, and his wife and his son had died, and he was so much in grief that he decided he would sell his farm and move to this solitary life that he now led. And then he noticed the area around him was devoid of trees, because the people here were charcoal burners, and all the trees had disappeared. And so he decided it was time for something to be done about this. And as he had nothing else special to do, he was the one who was going to do it. And so he had taken it upon himself to plant acorns and to plant an oak forest. Well, the next day Jean packed up his belongings and moved on, and after a while he forgot all about this acorn planting shepherd. And then a few years later, war broke out over Europe, and Jean found himself in the army and saw a lot of death and destruction. And when the war was over and he was demobbed, he decided he would go back and take this journey again that he had done previously. And he came again upon the village that he had seen that was desolate and deserted. And when he walked through the village, there was still nobody living there, but things had changed. He could hear there was water running in the brook. And when he looked in the well, he could actually see there was something in the bottom. And the river had brought seeds and other plants along with it. And there were willows growing at the side, and there was a meadow over here with grass and flowers. And then Jean, as he walked out the other side of the village, he could see in the distance the forest that Bouffier had planted. And he remembered what had happened. And so he went and found the shepherd. And he was amazed to see these oak trees, now 10 years old. And he asked the shepherd how he was getting on. And he said, well, now I only have 4 ewes because I had to get rid of the sheep. They were beginning to eat the shoots and destroying the trees. So I got rid of the sheep, and now I have beehives. But he was continuing with his project. And every day he would go out and plant his acorns. By this time the forest was 11 kilometers wide. Every year then Jean came to visit, and gradually the forest extended. At one point a forest warden came and warned Bouffier not to light a fire outside, or he might destroy this natural forest. Well, Bouffier just smiled and let him go on his way. And then a couple of years later, senior officials came from the Forestry Commission to see what could be done with this natural forest that had grown up so suddenly. And they thought about this and thought about that, but then eventually they decided just to protect it and make sure that nobody destroyed it. And by this time the forest was getting bigger and bigger. And then another war came into Europe. But you know what? Bouffier just ignored it altogether, and he continued with his project of planting acorns and making his forest bigger. And when Jean went back some years later to see his old friend, who was now 75 years old, he saw that the forest was now 20 kilometers wide, and there were beech trees and oak trees and maple trees that this old shepherd had planted. And he drove through the villages in a bus to go and see his old friend. And he realised, he thought at first he was in the wrong place because it had changed so much. But then he realised this was the same place, these were the same villages. But they had been transformed so much. Things were painted and tidy. There were children playing in the streets. Families had moved in. Grass was growing around the place. There were fruit and vegetables in the gardens. There was rye and barley in the fields. And there was a fountain had been built in the middle of the square. And beside it, a lime tree to show that regeneration had finally taken place. And Jean realized that his friend the shepherd had accomplished an amazing task. And when he died a few years later in a hospice, he realized that Bouffier had left an incredible legacy. He had shown that with perseverance, generosity, and investment, you could change the world around you.